Hello. Today, Erin and I are here to do silver soldering for you. It's kind of the magic of making jewelry with non-ferrous metals. So what we're going to be working with is silver solder. And silver solder comes in sheet and it also comes in wire. I like to introduce my students to working with the sheet and cutting up little pallions or chips versus the wire because you use more of the solder, so it's a little less expensive. What you need to know about solders is there's different melting temperatures. And so when you solder something together, like this piece, when I solder these two joints together, the silver and the copper, when I go to solder the brass onto that, the solder could reflow if I use the same temperature. So in the case of this, I used hard solder to put the silver and the copper together. And when I went to put the brass onto these other pieces, I used medium solder so that it didn't fall apart. So in your kit, you guys are going to have solder pieces like this, and we're gonna, the first day, stamp them all. So I've got an H for hard, an M for medium, and an E for easy. In the handout that you guys have, and I'm not going to hold it for too very long, read this because it'll clarify what I'm talking about with the different melting temperatures. There is a kind of a theory that you should use hard solder for everything, and hard solder is stronger, it color matches silver better. There are lots of good reasons about that, but after all these years of teaching, I kind of feel like beginning students need a little bit of a step up, and being able to use the different temperature solders helps you have a little bit more success when you're learning to solder. Today, we're going to be using medium solder only for our solder joints because I feel like medium solder gets high enough that you can almost melt something so you know when to get out. And it's also not so low that it happens so quickly that you don't see what the process is. So you guys are going to be getting your medium solder, and you're going to get your solder pieces. We're going to hand out pieces for you guys to solder it together so that you can really efficiently get the soldering done during the day. One of the things that I think is really important for people to know is when you're going to solder at your bench, you really need to think about your benches. This is where I do my soldering and my heat. This is where I do my cleanup and my sawing and my filing. And so trying to keep things separate is really important. We're going to be using the Maronite boards like we did for the annealing, and we'll be using those as well as a tripod and a couple of other things. But what you're going to need in the way of supplies is your solder, medium solder. You're going to need flux, and this is called handy flux, and mine's a little thin right at the moment because I had to thin it down. This is very finely ground borax, which is a type of glass, mixed with water, and it has a tendency to evaporate, but it has no shelf life, so you can just reconstitute it and reuse it and reuse it. So what does flux do? Flux actually keeps the oxides from building up on the surface so that the solder can bond to the metal. So when we were annealing, you saw all those really beautiful colors coming up on the metal. Those are oxides, and those oxides will inhibit the solder from bonding so that when you solder, you go to bend your piece of metal and it breaks. So flux is really important. The consistency of the flux, how much you use, is really important. Another thing you'll want to do is get yourself some kind of little container. This is an old ashtray that I converted into my place to put my solder chips. Just something, it could be a container, a jar lid that's not metal. It could be, some students use contact lens cases. Other people use the things that you put your spoon on your stove. But just anything to kind of keep your solder chips together. Another thing that you're going to need is a pair of tweezers, and these are my tweezers that I have that are really tiny, and they can pick up tiny little things, and these are the ones I like to solder with. I had to actually file and straighten out the nose of these before this demo today. So if you find yourself overheating your tweezers or sticking solder to them, I can help you clean up your tweezers, and you should be able to use these for many, many years. There's a larger pair that I have here. Sometimes when I'm working bigger, I don't like my hand in as close to the heat. And then the other thing I want to share with you is these are what are called interlocking tweezers. And I use these mainly for putting a post on something, where these are great is when you're squeezing and holding something, your hand will shake a little bit more. This is really lovely because you can just clamp onto it, and then I can just rest this in my hand, and it gives me a little bit more stable hand when I'm doing posts for earrings and things like that. So we do have these for you in your kit. I think you guys are supposed to buy your own tweezers. They're really important to have. If you don't have a good pair of tweezers, it makes soldering so frustrating. I have a lot of people come in with their eyebrow tweezers, and those don't pick up the small pieces that we need to pick up. These are a pair of scissors for cutting solder that will be really helpful if you have a good pair that is sharp. And then this is a soldering pick. And in the beginning, I used to not teach my students how to use a soldering pick because they would stick the soldering pick right through the metal when it was hot. But I'm finding that if I warn you guys, there's good purposes for using this. There's lots of different ways to solder. I'm going to show you by putting my solder chips directly on the piece. Sometimes I'll melt a ball of the solder, pick it up with my solder pick, and then place it on. And I'll be showing you guys that a little bit later in another demo. So the other thing that's really important is get yourself a paintbrush that's not too big, because we're working on a pretty small scale. So having a paintbrush for you with your flux is going to make a big difference. I have my water bowl here for quenching. I'm pretty much set up. My gas and air is on. If you need a reminder for that, ask me, but remember that parallel with a line is on and perpendicular is off. The other thing that we'll be handing out to you guys are Scotch-Brite pads. And I remember when I started doing jewelry, there was no such thing as 3M and Scotch-Brite. But Scotch-Brite pads work really well for cleaning your metal. I'm a real fan of the purple. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to be soldering. And even though this piece has come out of the pickle, I'm still going to use my Scotch-Brite pad to clean it a little bit better. I'm not going to do it on the fireboard. I'm going to do it right here, and you can see I'm just sanding the one side that I'm going to solder. And then I also do the back and the side. And you can see the difference. This is clean, this is not clean. Okay, and then I'm going to grab a piece of brass. So what I like to do with the butt joint is do brass and copper, because they're two different metals, and I'm going to need to be talking to you about that challenge. Can you see that this is not a straight joint? So I don't want any gaps. I want a nice tight fit. So I think I'm going to rotate this and put it like that. So now I got to go back to cleaning. And I remember when I was in school, my jewelry teacher said, if you don't like being fussy and cleaning metal and being really precise, you should go down to the sculpture department and work where they're working larger and not nearly as fussy. But that's what I'm going to work with there. When I go to solder this is called a butt joint. So what I want to show you are some samples of different butt joints. When I started teaching school, I started making samples. So this is a butt joint that I put together of something that I sawed out, and then a piece of copper that's been oxidized. And what it does is it gives you just a nice flat surface that with no variation of height. So then I challenged myself to do something with the 3 different metals, because they all heat differently and they all need special attention. And then I also wanted to show people that after you solder a butt joint, you can shape your metal and not have it fall apart. And so I always tell people that I think a silver solder joint is about 80% the strength of the base metal, whereas when you're welding, you can get 100% because you're actually casting it in place. That's on here. So another thing just to notice that you may or may not see is between the silver and the copper, there's really no silver solder line, but it's as thin as a hair. And then when you look between the copper and the brass, you see a little bit of the silver solder line, because the silver solder doesn't match the brass or the copper. And that's just something kind of that you have to live with. There are some brass solders that people are using today. If this bothers you, for me, if you fit it well enough together, your solder joint doesn't really even show. So this is one that it was a butt joint, and then I rolled it up into a tube. This is a butt joint for making like a band ring, so there's my joint there. So your butt joints don't have to just be flat. And then last but not least, here's my yin and yang. This is silver and this is bronze. And what I did is I sawed out the silver piece, then I set it on top of my bronze piece, and I traced it very carefully with my scribe, and then I very carefully sawed it to fit together. So having something that fits really well is really important when you're soldering. This is a technique called marriage of metals, because they just look like they just are all one piece, but the color difference. If you get a chance to look up and view marriage of metals pieces from the Japanese metalsmiths, they're some of the best in the world. The marriage of metals that they do is just really quite remarkable. And this is a good project to eventually get yourself to be doing, is some marriage of metals pieces. Okay, so these are the butt joints. I'm going to just quickly go over the other ones. I'm going to demo the butt joint, and then on the next video we'll show you the right angle. And the right angle really does a beautiful structural thing. It actually creates something now where this piece of sheet metal is not going to bend. So I've kind of created an I-beam. And students always say to me, well, why do I need to learn how to do a butt joint? Some of it is for hollow fabrication, but what I like to point out is that when you make a bezel for a stone setting, that's a butt joint. So really learning how to do that is really important. So the way I have this set up, I do it so that the butt joint's the easiest. The right angle has some differences but similar. And then I like to go to what's called sweat soldering. And sweat soldering, I talk about it as being an Oreo cookie. You've got your metal, and then your metal, and you flow solder on one side, and then you stick them together and you reheat them, and that solder bonds the two together. I used to have an Oreo cookie in my solder box, and I had it for about 10 years, and then it started to kind of mold and deteriorate, but it took about 10 years. But sweat soldering is a really wonderful process because it gives you variation in height. It can give you really clean color changes in the metals. And then you can stack a lot of things together to create some really intricate pieces. If you want to look up more about sweat soldering, I highly recommend that you look up Hopi Indian jewelry and also Navajo jewelry. They use the sweat soldering techniques in a really delightful, very creative design way of doing it. So that's going to be the third one we're going to do. And then the fourth one is soldering wire to sheet. And wire to sheet is creating like almost drawing on metal. And it's a really nice way to get some imagery. So this one I think is turned around this way. Kind of wanted it to make it look like it was a mountain range. And then I wanted to show people how you can solder little balls onto it. And so when you start working with wire onto sheet, you can just really create really elaborate surfaces. And I really recommend that you learn to do this before you go into doing filigree, which is also another metalsmithing technique that is really beautiful. This is a wire to sheet. It's my little bail on the back of my piece. And really that's a butt joint, but it is wire to sheet. And when I flip it over, you can see the patterning that I've done on there. This one has twisted wire, which is a little bit more challenging to do. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then what I love to do also is I like to emboss, which I've already shown you guys before how to do with my feather earrings. But then you can go back in and then you can solder wire onto your sheet so that you've got a low level, the surface of the metal, and then the wire. So once you guys start learning these processes, you're going to be able to start assembling things pretty quickly. And being a lot more creative with how you're going about putting pieces together. Another one is a tube to sheet. And tube to sheet can be really nice just design-wise, but think of it in terms as a stone setting, so a bezel setting or something like that. So you'll be doing that. And then last but not least is what's called scoring and bending. And I'll be showing you guys how to take a flat piece of metal and score it so that it bends right where you remove some material, and then you solder it back together and you can start creating some hollow constructed boxes or lockets or things like that. So once you get started soldering, you're going to find that there's a lot of variation amongst all of these samples that are here. But I do want you guys to start out by doing your butt joint, your right angle, your sweat solder, because what you learn from your butt joint is going to help you with your sweat solder, which is going to help you with, or your right angle, and then your sweat solder, and so on. So do follow the system. The other thing is we've cut a whole bunch of metal up for you guys, because there's always somebody, I go, this is the size we're going to be working in, and then they come to me with problems because their metal is like 4 inches by 4 inches. And so the larger you work, the more challenge you have getting the heat. So if you have questions about these solder joints, make sure that you go to Canvas and that you look up our handout of the different solderings, and it'll tell you which ones to do. Just as a quick reminder, over here there is a bunch of resource books. Up here we have the one that has all the syllabuses. If you're here and you can't get into your Canvas, we have paper copies here for you to work with. So please ask us if we need some help. And you definitely need to read all of this before you start soldering, because it talks about the different temperatures, and it literally gives you a step-by-step how to solder that I think will be really helpful. Okay, shall we stop here?
Sure.